Click subscribe now. It's safer that way. Trust me, after what I'm about to tell you, you'll want to stay close to the light. Hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because what happened in that small town changed everything I thought I knew about evil. This is a true story. For safety reasons, we've changed the names of the location and everyone involved. My name is Father Peter, and I've been an exorcist for the Catholic Church for over 20 years. I've seen things that would make most people question their sanity, witnessed manifestations of evil that defy every natural law, but nothing, absolutely nothing prepared me for what I encountered in a small rural town in the American Midwest. This is the story of a girl named Sarah, a forbidden book, and a prophecy of death that came true in the most horrifying way imaginable. When people think about exorcisms, they picture dramatic scenes from movies, heads spinning, voices changing, but the real horror is far more subtle and infinitely more terrifying. It starts small with whispers in the dark, shadows that move when they shouldn't, and visions that blur the line between gift and curse. Sarah was just 6 years old when an ancient grimoire fell into her innocent hands, a book that should never have been touched by a child, a book that some say contains the very secrets Solomon used to command demons. What began as precognitive visions, simple predictions that came true with unsettling accuracy, escalated into something far darker. Sarah predicted her own death. She predicted a fire that would consume 15 members of her extended family, and she predicted that I would be the one standing between her tortured soul and eternal damnation. This isn't just a story about supernatural abilities or demonic possession. This is a testimony of how thin the veil really is between our world and the abyss, and what happens when a pure soul becomes a battleground for forces beyond human comprehension. What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you believe about good and evil, free will and destiny, and the terrible price some pay for seeing beyond the curtain of our reality. Before I continue, I need you to do something important. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Share this video with someone who needs to hear the truth about what's really happening in the spiritual realm. The church doesn't want these stories told, but people need to know. So subscribe, like this video, and let's continue. I received the call on a Tuesday morning in October. The voice belonged to Margaret Chun, a woman whose desperation reached through the phone like a physical force. She was calling from Millbrook, a town so small it barely appeared on most maps, nestled in the hills of rural Missouri. Margaret's sister Dorothy had passed away 3 months earlier, and her 11-year-old niece Sarah had died just weeks after from what doctors said was severe pneumonia. But Margaret didn't believe it. She believed something far darker had taken Sarah, and she needed me to understand why. I arrived in Millbrook on a gray Thursday afternoon when the autumn leaves were turning the color of dried blood. Margaret met me at a small diner on Main Street, her hands trembling as she clutched a coffee cup that had gone cold. She had dark circles under her eyes that spoke of countless sleepless nights. When she looked at me, I saw the haunted expression of someone who'd glimpsed the other side and could never unsee it. Her sister Dorothy had been the eldest of 17 children, born to Thomas and Patricia Wilson, a deeply religious farming family. The youngest was Sarah, born when Patricia was 46, viewed as a special blessing. From the beginning, Sarah was different. Uncommonly perceptive, seeming to know things she shouldn't, feeling emotions before anyone spoke them. The other children were boisterous, but Sarah was quiet, watchful, with eyes that seemed far older than her years. When Sarah was 6, she accompanied her mother to the town center. There was a thrift store run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Carmichael, who'd moved from New Orleans decades earlier. Mrs. Carmichael took an immediate liking to Sarah and began giving the child small gifts. One day, she gave Sarah a book. It was old, bound in cracked leather, pages yellowed and brittle, covered in dense text and strange diagrams mixing Latin, Hebrew, and symbols belonging to no language I'd ever studied. Patricia Wilson, a good Catholic woman, assumed it was a prayer book. She had no idea Mrs. Carmichael had just handed her daughter one of the most dangerous occult texts ever compiled. The Book of St. Cyprian, a grimoire that some say was written by King Solomon to command demons, while others claim it was penned by a medieval sorcerer who'd made a pact with entities from beyond the veil. It's not something any responsible person would give to a child. Sarah, unusually bright and already teaching herself to read, became immediately fascinated. She carried it everywhere, studying the symbols with determination that worried her mother. Within weeks, she'd made remarkable progress. Within months, she claimed to have read it cover to cover. What became clear was that something had changed in Sarah after she acquired that book. The visions started small. Sarah would mention someone was coming to visit, and hours later, that person would arrive unannounced. She'd describe what her father would find checking the fence line, and he'd discover exactly what she'd said. At first, the family found it charming, but Dorothy noticed something the others missed. The visions were becoming more frequent and detailed. Sarah wasn't guessing. She was seeing things, actual images that came primarily in sleep, but sometimes while awake. Sarah began complaining about shadows in her bedroom, figures watching her sleep. She spoke of whispers in unknown languages, voices from the walls. She described seeing her reflection move independently in mirrors, turning to look at her with eyes that weren't quite her own. During one visit when Sarah was 8, the child told Dorothy that the book had shown her how to see, not with her eyes, but with her soul. The book taught her to step outside of time, to look at threads connecting all moments, past and future, woven in patterns most people never perceive. Sarah spoke with eerie calm about entities she called the Watchers, beings that existed in the spaces between seconds, observing human lives like we might watch fish in an aquarium. She said they'd been waiting for someone like her, someone young enough to be molded, sensitive enough to perceive them, innocent enough to trust them. Dorothy asked to see the book, and holding it, she felt physical revulsion, a cold sensation radiating from the pages as if the book were somehow alive. The leather binding felt wrong under her fingers, simultaneously too hot and too cold, pulsing with energy that made her skin crawl. She opened it to a random page and saw diagrams of circles and symbols, instructions written in languages that shifted and changed even as she looked at them, as if the text itself resisted being read by the uninitiated. She slammed it shut and thrust it back at Sarah, her heart racing, a voice in her head screaming at her to run, to get away from this cursed object. Dorothy confronted Patricia, explaining this grimoire was dangerous. But Patricia had a blind spot when it came to recognizing evil that didn't present itself obviously. She argued that if the book were truly evil, Surely Mrs. Carmichael wouldn't have given it to Sarah. She insisted Sarah's visions were a gift from God. Dorothy returned to Chicago frustrated and worried. This was her greatest regret, that she hadn't fought harder to get that book away from Sarah. When Sarah was 9, her visions took on a new quality. More vivid, more specific, more focused on future events. She predicted a storm that would destroy the Henderson barn, describing the exact lightning strike pattern 2 days before it happened. She told her father which crop section would fail, allowing him to treat it. She warned her brother Michael not to take his truck on a specific Tuesday, and that Tuesday there was a massive highway pileup that would have killed him. But Sarah was changing in disturbing ways. She became withdrawn, spending hours alone with that cursed book, speaking in cryptic phrases pulled from the grimoire. She stopped attending school, claiming other children's thoughts were too loud. Patricia agreed to homeschool her, not recognizing she was enabling Sarah's isolation and deepening connection to whatever forces the book had awakened. Dorothy visited when Sarah was 10 and was shocked. Sarah seemed skeletal, skin pale, eyes ringed with dark circles. She moved like a ghost, and when she looked at you, it felt like she was seeing through you, perceiving things about your soul you'd never acknowledged. Sarah approached Dorothy in the kitchen late one evening and took her hand. The girl's fingers were ice cold despite summer heat. Sarah said she'd seen Dorothy's death. It would come soon, within months, and it would be sudden. She described a hospital room with green walls, machines beeping, Dorothy surrounded by strangers except Margaret holding her hand. Sarah said she'd seen this vision multiple times, always exactly the same, and visions that repeated couldn't be changed. Then Sarah told Dorothy her death was connected to a much larger pattern that would culminate in tragedy, consuming the Wilson family. Sarah had seen fire that would take many relatives, fire starting in a house by the ocean. She described the house in detail. A massive 3-story structure with white siding and blue shutters, a wraparound porch, and a view of the Atlantic Ocean. Dorothy left shaken and began researching the Book of St. Cyprian. What she discovered terrified her. Every source warned against using it without proper training. The rituals were designed to contact intelligences existing outside normal perception, entities some called demons. What disturbed Dorothy most was a pattern in historical accounts. Many who'd used the book developed precognitive abilities, and nearly all died young, often in circumstances related to their own prophecies, as if seeing the future somehow bound them to a fate they couldn't escape. Dorothy tried sharing her research with Thomas and Patricia, but they dismissed her concerns. 3 months later, Dorothy collapsed at her Chicago office. Doctors discovered an aggressive brain aneurysm. She lingered 6 days in the ICU, in a room with green walls, surrounded by medical staff Margaret had never met, with Margaret holding her hand exactly as Sarah described. Dorothy's final words to Margaret were a desperate plea to get Sarah away from that book, to find someone who understood these matters, to save the girl before it was too late. Margaret tried. She drove to Millbrook and spent a week arguing with her parents about Sarah, begging them to consult someone who understood spiritual warfare. But Thomas and Patricia were grieving and couldn't bear to hear their youngest might be in danger too. They insisted Dorothy's death was tragic coincidence. Sarah seemed strangely unaffected. At the funeral, she stood silent and dry-eyed, staring at the casket with an expression that disturbed Margaret. Not grief or shock, but resignation, or perhaps satisfaction. After the funeral, Sarah approached Margaret and said Dorothy's death was the first thread being cut, and soon there would be more, and Margaret needed to be ready because she would have a choice when the fire came. The months following Dorothy's death brought escalation. Sarah woke screaming from nightmares about burning bodies, people trapped in smoke-filled rooms, flames consuming flesh, while voices begged for mercy. She stopped eating, claiming food tasted like ash. She rarely left her room, spending time reading that cursed grimoire, whispering passages in Latin and Hebrew she shouldn't understand. The other Wilson children began avoiding Sarah. Being near her felt wrong, like standing too close to something radioactive. The family dog refused to enter her room and would whine if anyone tried bringing him inside. When Sarah was 11, she had the vision that would set the final tragedy in motion. It was March. Sarah cornered Margaret in the hallway late at night, grabbed her arm with surprising strength, and told her exactly what would happen. There would be a gathering during the holidays. A distant relative named Robert Wilson, who'd made a fortune in real estate, would invite the extended family to spend New Year's at his beach house in North Carolina. Most would accept. But they shouldn't go, Sarah insisted. The house would burn. Early morning hours of January 2nd after midnight, when everyone was asleep after celebrating. The fire would start on the first floor and spread quickly, racing upstairs to the second floor where bedrooms were located. People would die, many people, trapped in rooms, or overcome by smoke. Sarah described the screams, the smell, the sight of the house collapsing while fire trucks arrived too late. She described the house in perfect detail, this house she'd never seen, owned by a man she'd never met. White siding, blue shutters, 3 stories, wraparound porch, situated on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic. She described the interior layout, furniture placement, bedroom colors, details she couldn't possibly know. Then Sarah told Margaret the most disturbing part. She'd seen the list of who would die and who would survive, and the only variable was whether certain people went at all. Margaret warned everyone. She told her parents about Sarah's vision, begged them not to go if the invitation came. But they were exhausted from Sarah's dark prophecies. They'd normalized it, convinced themselves it was mental illness and overactive imagination. In June, Sarah developed what appeared to be severe flu, high fever, respiratory distress. But Sarah wasn't healthy. Years of inadequate nutrition, poor sleep, and whatever spiritual toll the book exacted had left her weak. The flu progressed to pneumonia with frightening speed. Doctors administered antibiotics and oxygen, but Sarah's condition deteriorated. Margaret received the call on a Wednesday evening. Sarah was dying. Doctors couldn't explain why antibiotics weren't working, why her body seemed to be giving up. Margaret drove through the night and arrived hours before Sarah passed. When Margaret entered the room, Sarah was barely responsive. But when she saw Margaret, something flickered in her eyes. Sarah reached out a skeletal hand and grasped Margaret's wrist. She whispered that it was almost over, that she was being released, but the vision would still come true. The fire would still happen. People would still die. And Margaret would survive, but only if she was smart, only if she remembered everything and acted when the time came. Sarah said someone would come after, someone who would understand, someone who could help finish what needed finishing. Then her grip relaxed. Her eyes closed, and within minutes she was gone. The Wilson family buried Sarah beside Dorothy. At the reception, Margaret overheard relatives discussing a letter that had arrived days before Sarah's death from Robert Wilson, the wealthy developer, extending an invitation to the entire Wilson clan to join him for holidays at his beach house in the Outer Banks. He'd renovated the property to accommodate everyone and wanted to reconnect with his Midwest relatives, offering to cover all expenses. Margaret felt ice water flood her veins. The invitation came exactly as Sarah predicted. Margaret began trying to convince her family not to accept, reminding them of Sarah's vision. But she was fighting a losing battle. The Wilsons were reeling from Sarah's death, and the idea of a free vacation was too appealing. The children especially were excited, many having never seen the ocean. As months passed and holidays approached, Margaret watched helplessly as her family prepared. She continued voicing objections, but was dismissed as someone processing grief. By mid-December, 35 family members had accepted Robert's invitation. Margaret made one final desperate attempt. She decided she would go herself, ostensibly to participate, but actually to keep watch, to stay alert for danger, to be ready to get people out if anything seemed wrong. She remembered Sarah's words about having a choice, about surviving if she was smart. But what Margaret didn't understand is that predictions generated through grimoires don't show inevitable futures. They show probable futures that become more likely the more you focus on them, the more you believe them, the more you shape actions around them. It's spiritual manipulation, a way dark forces trap people in negative timelines by making them think they're powerless. True prophecy from God always includes hope, a path to redemption. False prophecy from demons presents doom as inevitable and guides people toward fulfilling it. Margaret packed her bags and drove to North Carolina, arriving 2 days after Christmas, ready to protect her family from the fire Sarah had seen coming. The house was exactly as Sarah described. White siding, blue shutters, 3 stories, wraparound porch, stunning Atlantic view. Margaret sat in her car staring, feeling reality tilt as vision and present merged. Every detail matched. The window placement, trim color, even the weather vane shaped like a whale. Inside was even more unsettling. Margaret recognized the layout from Sarah's descriptions. She knew which rooms were bedrooms, where staircases were located, knew the kitchen had granite countertops before seeing them. It was like stepping into a photograph she'd been shown months earlier. Over the next days, Margaret barely slept. She wandered the house at night, checking smoke detectors, examining outlets, looking for fire hazards. She stayed hyper-aware of where everyone was, mentally mapping evacuation routes. The family thought she was acting strangely, but attributed it to grief. New Year's Eve arrived. The family celebrated with dinner and a beach bonfire. Margaret stayed sober while others drank, watched midnight fireworks while silently counting down to what Sarah predicted. When the party wound down around 2 a.m., Margaret positioned herself in a first-floor living room chair, facing the stairs, determined to stay awake. But exhaustion overtook vigilance. She fell asleep around 3:30, her consciousness slipping despite desperate attempts to stay alert. She slept perhaps 20 minutes, and in that window her subconscious betrayed her. She began to dream. Sarah appeared, looking healthy and whole, smiling. Sarah took Margaret's hand and told her it was okay to rest, that danger had passed. that the vision was wrong. Margaret woke to smoke smell. She jerked upright, heart hammering, mind struggling to process what was happening through the fog of interrupted sleep. For a fraction of a second she thought she was still dreaming, that this was another nightmare. But then the smoke detectors began their urgent wailing, filling the house with sound that pierced through any remaining confusion. And she knew with horrible certainty that Sarah's prophecy was unfolding exactly as predicted. Smoke detectors screamed throughout the house, a cacophony of electronic shrieks that should have woken everyone immediately, but wouldn't. Margaret would later realize, because the smoke had already begun its deadly work on the upper floors where most people were sleeping. Gray smoke was already beginning to fill the first floor, not wisps or traces, but thick clouds pouring from the direction of the kitchen in volumes that suggested. The fire had been burning for longer than seemed possible given how recently she'd fallen asleep. Through the increasing haze, she could see the orange glow of flames through the kitchen doorway, angry light dancing against the walls, and she could hear a sound like a massive beast breathing, the roar of fire feeding on wood and fabric and whatever accelerants might have been present. The fire had started exactly as Sarah predicted, in the early morning hours of January 2nd, after the clock had ticked past midnight into the new day, on the first floor while everyone slept off the celebrations, and it was spreading with impossible speed that defied every natural law of combustion. Margaret understood, racing up the walls toward the second and third floors where everyone was sleeping, where children and grandparents and siblings were still lost in dreams, unaware that death was climbing toward them through the vents and stairwells. Margaret ran to the stairs, screaming for everyone to wake up, to get out. She heard confused voices from upper floors, people stumbling from beds. The smoke was getting thicker. Margaret made it halfway up the first staircase before heat drove her back. The fire had reached the second floor, blocking one escape route. She ran to the other staircase, but that was worse. Flames more advanced, smoke impenetrable. People were trapped upstairs. Margaret heard them coughing, crying, calling for help. She tried going up again, but heat was too intense, smoke too thick. Someone grabbed her from behind and dragged her toward the front door, another family member who'd made it down before stairs became impassable. They stumbled onto the lawn, gasping cold ocean air, and turned to see the house fully engulfed, fire consuming the structure with speed, defying natural explanation. Fire trucks arrived within 15 minutes. But 15 minutes was eternity. By the time firefighters approached, the second and third floors had collapsed into the first. They sprayed water for hours, but it was clear no one inside could have survived. When the sun rose and fire was extinguished, investigators began searching debris. They found the bodies. 15 people died. 15 Wilson family members, ages 14 to 48, all killed by smoke inhalation or burns, all trapped in bedrooms or hallways trying to escape. The victims included Margaret's parents, Thomas and Patricia, who'd apparently tried saving younger children and been overcome. Several of Margaret's siblings, cousins, nieces, and nephews. The exact list matched what Sarah had predicted months earlier, before she'd known this gathering would happen, before she'd heard of Robert Wilson. And Margaret survived just as Sarah said, but not because she'd been smart or vigilant. She survived because she'd fallen asleep in a first-floor chair instead of going to a bedroom upstairs. She survived by chance Or perhaps because the prophecy required a witness, someone who would live to tell the story, someone who would carry the weight of knowing every detail, came true exactly as a dead 11-year-old had foreseen. Margaret fell apart afterward, her psychological defenses crumbling like a house with a rotted foundation, unable to support the weight of what she'd witnessed and what she knew she'd failed to prevent. Consumed by guilt that ate at her from the inside like acid, she was tormented by endless loops of what-ifs and if-onlys that played in her mind during every waking hour and invaded her dreams when she finally managed to sleep. What if she'd fought harder to convince her family not to go? What if she'd destroyed that book when she first took it from Sarah's room? What if she'd stayed awake that night instead of falling asleep in the chair? What if she'd been smarter, faster, braver, better? She was haunted by the screams she'd heard from upstairs, screams that seemed to be permanently recorded in her auditory memory, playing back at random moments triggered by sounds that bore no resemblance to human agony, but somehow reminded her anyway. She was haunted by the faces she'd seen in the windows before the smoke obscured everything. Faces of people she loved, faces twisted with terror and desperation, faces that called out to her for help she couldn't provide, faces that accused her of surviving when they had not. She was hospitalized for psychological trauma multiple times in the months following the fire, spending weeks in treatment facilities where well-meaning psychiatrists tried to help her process what they called survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder, clinical terms that felt woefully inadequate to describe the magnitude of what she was experiencing. They gave her medications to help her sleep, medications to manage her anxiety, medications to lift her depression, medications to stop the panic attacks that struck without warning, leaving her gasping and trembling and convinced she was dying. But nothing helped, because the real problem wasn't psychological in origin, or at least not entirely. The nightmares that plagued her were relentless, and they weren't just memories of the fire replaying in her sleeping mind. They weren't normal trauma responses that therapy and time might eventually heal. These were something else, something that originated outside her own psyche and used her dreams as a doorway to torment her. She began having visions of her own experiences that started weeks after the fire and steadily intensified. She would see Sarah standing in corners of rooms, not the healthy childhood Sarah that Margaret wanted to remember, but the Sarah of those final years, skeletal and pale with those ancient eyes. Sometimes the apparition would just watch her silently, a presence that made Margaret's skin crawl and filled her with dread so profound she could barely breathe. Other times it would speak, whispering things in languages Margaret didn't understand, words that sounded like threats or perhaps invitations, phrases that seemed designed to burrow into her subconscious and take root there like poisonous seeds. She heard whispers in unknown languages when she was alone, voices that seemed to come from behind walls or from inside closets or from beneath her bed, voices that stopped abruptly when she tried to locate their source, as if they were playing a sadistic game of hide and seek with her sanity. She felt presences around her that she couldn't explain rationally, cold spots in rooms that had no windows or air conditioning, shadows that moved in her peripheral vision, but vanished when she turned to look directly at them, a constant sensation of being watched by something that meant her harm. During one hospitalization, a nurse suggested she might benefit from talking to someone with experience in spiritual matters. The nurse was Catholic and had heard stories, from her priest about a specialist dealing with cases outside normal pastoral care. She gave Margaret my name. Margaret called me 6 months after the fire. That's how I ended up in a diner in Millbrook, listening to this impossible story, trying to determine whether I was dealing with genuine demonic activity or psychological trauma aftermath. I've learned these aren't always mutually exclusive. Demons often work through trauma, using it as an entry point to torment people broken by tragedy. I asked Margaret if she still had Sarah's book. She said she'd taken it from Sarah's room after the funeral, that it was in a safe deposit box because she was too frightened to keep it in her house, but also too frightened to destroy it. That told me everything. The book was still exerting influence, maintaining its hold through fear and spiritual contamination. I told Margaret I would need to see the book and perform what's called a spiritual cleansing, not just of the grimoire, but of the spiritual legacy it created. This would require accessing the house where Sarah lived, the room where she'd spent time with the book, because that space would be saturated with residual energy that could continue causing problems for years. The next day, we drove to the Wilson farm. The property had been sold, but new owners were sympathetic when I explained I needed to perform religious rituals for closure. They gave us access, mentioning they'd experienced strange occurrences, cold spots, objects moving, general unease they'd attributed to the house being old. Sarah's room was on the second floor, a small space at the hallway's end. When I stepped inside, I immediately felt what they meant. The air was heavier, colder than the rest of the house. I could sense the residue of what happened here. Years of a child opening doorways she didn't understand, inviting things and that should have been kept out. I had Margaret wait downstairs while I prepared. I blessed the space with holy water, recited protection prayers, set up candles at cardinal points, and created a salt circle that would contain anything manifesting during the ritual. Then I had Margaret bring the grimoire from her car, where she'd kept it locked in the trunk, wrapped in cloth like a toxic substance. When I unwrapped and held the book for the first time, I understood why Sarah had been so affected. The grimoire wasn't just spell collection. It was a conduit, a physical object used so many times by so many practitioners that it had become a beacon for spiritual entities. Touching it was like touching a live wire of dark energy. I placed the book in the salt circle's center and began the ritual. What I encountered confirmed my worst suspicions. Sarah hadn't just been reading the book, she'd been using it, actively and deliberately performing the rituals described in its pages, speaking the invocations, opening herself as a vessel for forces that had been waiting for exactly such an opportunity, for exactly such a pure and undefended soul. The entities manifesting during cleansing weren't demons in the traditional sense, not the fallen angels from Christian theology that most people imagine when they think of spiritual warfare, not Lucifer's lieutenants cast down from heaven. They were something older than that paradigm, something that existed before human religions gave names to the forces of darkness, something existing in the spaces between realities and the gaps where dimensions brush against each other, where the fabric of our world grows thin and permeable. These were intelligences that fed on human consciousness the way we might feed on bread, that experienced time differently than we do, perceiving past and future simultaneously, able to see the branching paths of probability and possibility that stretch out from every human choice. They used books like this grimoire as fishing lines cast into our world, hooks baited with promises of knowledge and power, waiting patiently for someone to bite, someone to open themselves to the connection, someone like Sarah, who had both the sensitivity to perceive them and the innocence to trust them. They'd hooked Sarah when she was 6 years old, so young that she hadn't developed the psychological defenses that protect most adults from such intrusions, so trusting that she didn't question the voices that began whispering to her through the pages of that cursed book. They reeled her in slowly over 5 years, carefully and methodically, the way a fisherman plays a particularly valuable catch, not rushing, allowing her to tire herself out with resistance until she finally surrendered completely to their influence. They used her developing psychic sensitivity, which might have been a genuine gift from God if properly nurtured and protected, twisting it into a weapon that served their purposes. They taught her to generate accurate prophecies, not to help people, but to bind them, to create psychological conditions that would ensure certain timelines manifested, certain events occurred, certain deaths happened exactly as foreseen. The prophecies weren't warnings meant to prevent tragedy. They were scripts, carefully written scenarios that manipulated everyone involved into playing their assigned roles, including Margaret, who thought she was defying fate, but was actually fulfilling it by her very presence at the beach house. And here's the truly diabolical part that I explained to Margaret later, the aspect of this case that still haunts me and challenges my understanding of how evil operates in our world. Sarah's death at 11 years old had not been natural, not in any conventional sense. Yes, pneumonia had killed her physical body, her lungs filling with fluid, her fever burning through her weakened system. But the underlying cause, the reason her body couldn't fight off what should have been a manageable illness, was that the entities had finished with her. They had drained everything they needed from her consciousness, extracted every bit of psychic energy they required to fuel their manipulation of events, used her up like a battery that had finally run dry, and then they simply let her go, withdrawing the spiritual energy that had been keeping her alive despite the physical toll of their contact. Despite the years of inadequate sleep and poor nutrition, and the constant assault on her nervous system from visions and visitations, the pneumonia killed her body. What her soul had already been consumed, hollowed out and discarded, leaving behind just enough of her essence to deliver that final message to Margaret, the message that would ensure Margaret would go to the beach house and witness the prophecy's fulfillment, completing the pattern these entities had spent 5 years constructing. The cleansing ritual lasted 6 hours, 6 hours that felt like 6 days, time stretching and contracting in ways that suggested the entities were manipulating my perception, even as I fought them. During that time, I experienced manifestations that would have sent most people, even most priests, running from that house and never returning. Manifestations that pushed the boundaries of what I thought was possible, even after 2 decades of fighting spiritual battles. I experienced cold so intense I could see my breath misting in front of my face despite the summer heat outside, despite the fact that it was August and the temperature in the rest of the house was probably 85 degrees. The cold wasn't natural, wasn't physical in the normal sense. It was the absence of life, the temperature of the void of spaces where nothing has ever lived, and nothing ever will. My fingers went numb. My joints ached. Frost actually began forming on the inside of the windows. Delicate patterns of ice crystals, spreading across the glass like the fingers of something trying to get in, or perhaps trying to keep me trapped inside. I heard voices speaking in languages I recognized from ancient texts I'd studied in seminary, languages that haven't been spoken aloud for thousands of years, languages that were old when Rome was young. Sumerian, Akkadian, something that might have been Proto-Indo-European, but twisted, corrupted, as if the grammar itself had been infected with malevolence. The voices weren't coming from any specific direction. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the air, from inside my own skull. Multiple speakers talking over each other, harmonizing in ways that human vocal cords couldn't produce, creating resonances that made my teeth ache and my eyes water. Shadows moved with apparent intelligence throughout the room. Not random movements caused by flickering candles, but deliberate motions. Shadows reaching toward me with appendages that looked almost like hands, with fingers too long and joints that bent in wrong directions. These shadows moved against the light, defying every physical law about how darkness and illumination interact. They reached toward me, testing the boundaries of the salt circle, probing for weaknesses, looking for any gap in my concentration or faith that would allow them to breach the barrier I directed. Objects in the room began to shake and rattle without any physical cause. No earthquakes, no wind, just pure kinetic energy being exerted by will alone. The bed frame trembled. The dresser drawers slid open and slammed shut in rhythmic patterns that might have been some kind of communication. The window glass vibrated in its frame, producing a low humming note that harmonized unpleasantly with the voices still echoing through the room. Small items, pens and books and knickknacks, began lifting off surfaces and floating in meter for seconds before dropping back down with sounds louder than they should have made, as if the entities were showing me they could manipulate matter, that the physical world was just as much under their influence as the spiritual realm I was trying to defend. The worst moment came when I saw Sarah herself, or something wearing Sarah's appearance like a costume, something that had studied her features and mannerisms so thoroughly that it could produce a nearly perfect replica, standing in the corner of the room where the shadows were darkest, watching me with eyes that were completely black, no whites visible at all, just obsidian spheres that reflected the candlelight like polished stones. The thing that looked like Sarah was smiling, but the smile was all wrong. Too wide, showing too many teeth, expressing an emotion that had nothing to do with joy or happiness, and everything to do with predatory satisfaction. The apparition spoke, but the voice that emerged wasn't Sarah's sweet, childish voice that Margaret had described to me, the voice that had once asked innocent questions and laughed at simple joys. This was multiple voices layered together in impossible harmonies, at least 3 or 4 distinct speakers talking simultaneously, but perfectly synchronized, creating words that no single human throat could produce. The sounds came from everywhere at once, from the walls and floor and ceiling, from inside my own head, vibrating through my bones and resonating in my chest cavity. It told me I was too late, speaking with absolute certainty, and perhaps a hint of amusement at my futile efforts. The work was done, it said, completed years ago when Sarah first opened that book and invited them in, when she spoke the words of invocation without understanding what she was summoning, when she offered herself as a vessel without knowing the price. The deaths had already fed the pattern, it explained, The 15 souls who died in that fire had poured their energy and suffering into channels that these entities had been constructing for generations, perhaps centuries, using people like Sarah as nodes in a vast network spanning time and space. Nothing I did now could undo what had been accomplished. The voices informed me, their tone suggesting they were enjoying explaining this to me, savoring my growing understanding of how thoroughly I'd been outmaneuvered. The deaths had already happened. The prophecy had already been fulfilled. The pattern was complete, and my presence here, my attempt to cleanse this room and destroy the book, was itself part of a larger design that had anticipated my involvement from the very beginning. It mocked me then, the tone shifting from clinical explanation to something closer to cruel laughter, suggesting that my very presence here in Sarah's room was actually completing a larger ritual that had been set in motion years ago, that by burning the book and speaking the words of exorcism, I was actually closing a circle that these entities wanted closed, sealing power they wanted sealed, finalizing a working that required both the creation and the destruction of the grimoire to function properly. It suggested I was dancing to their tune just as surely as Sarah had, just as surely as Margaret had, just as surely as every single person who died in that fire had. All of us puppets operated by fingers we couldn't see, moved by intentions we couldn't comprehend. And then it said something that has haunted me ever since, something I've never shared with Margaret or anyone else, because I'm still not certain if it was truth or merely a final, psychological assault meant to undermine my faith and my purpose. The entity wearing Sarah's face told me that she had known that in her final moments before the pneumonia claimed her, Sarah had achieved a moment of terrible clarity, where she understood everything that had been done to her, everything she'd been used for, every manipulation and deception that had led to her own death, and the deaths of 15 people she loved. In that moment of understanding, the entity claimed Sarah had tried to warn Margaret one last time, had tried to break free of their control long enough to tell the truth about what was really happening, but they'd silenced her, withdrawn the last bits of energy, keeping her alive, let the pneumonia finish its work before she could reveal their plans. The entity suggested that Sarah's final message to Margaret, the warning about the fire and the promise that someone would come to help, had actually been corrupted, twisted from what Sarah really wanted to say, used as a final manipulation to ensure Margaret would go to the beach house and complete their design. I felt genuine fear in that moment, real visceral terror that perhaps this thing was right, that maybe I was being used just as Sarah had been used, that maybe everything I thought I understood about spiritual warfare and the battle between good and evil was far more complicated than I'd been taught, that maybe these entities operated on levels of subtlety and long-term planning that made human comprehension impossible. I wondered if faith itself might be another layer of the manipulation, another way these beings controlled us, if even my certainty in God's power might be exactly what they wanted me to feel at this exact moment for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. I felt genuine fear in that moment, wondering if maybe this thing was right, that maybe I was being used just as Sarah had been. But faith isn't absence of fear. Faith is choosing to move forward despite fear, trusting God's power as greater than anything darkness can manifest. I continued the ritual, speaking exorcism words, commanding entities to leave and never return, sealing the room and book against further contamination. The manifestations intensified, temperature dropping further, objects shaking. Then suddenly it was over. Temperature normalized, oppressive feeling lifted, and the room felt clean for the first time in years. I took the grimoire, still contained in the salt circle, and carried it outside. Margaret had built a fire pit at my instruction. We burned the book there, watching ancient pages curl and blacken, leather binding bubble and split. Whatever dark power bound in those pages released and dispersed into smoke that rose and dissipated harmlessly. It took hours for the book to completely burn, much longer than normal paper and leather should take, but eventually it was reduced to ash. I buried those ashes in a metal box at a crossroads 10 miles from the farm, in a location I won't specify because some things are better left unfound. The cleansing helped Margaret significantly. Nightmares decreased, visions stopped, the feeling of being watched faded, but she would never be the same. She'd lost too much, seen too much, and carried survivor's guilt no amount of ritual or therapy could completely erase. But the story doesn't end there. Other survivors of the fire began experiencing their own supernatural problems in following months and years. Some reported seeing victims in dreams. Others claimed developing precognitive abilities. A few became convinced they were being haunted by something present at the fire, something that had fed on deaths and was now following survivors. I worked with several of these people, performing cleansings and exorcisms. What I discovered was that the fire itself had become a spiritual epicenter, a point where the barrier between worlds had been deliberately weakened through Sarah's prophecies and the entities working through her. The deaths of 15 people in a single traumatic event created what occultists call a power site, a location saturated with suffering energy. The beach house burned to the ground, but the land remained contaminated. Robert Wilson sold the property for almost nothing to a developer who planned to rebuild. But every construction attempt was plagued by accidents, equipment failures, workers reporting feeling sick or frightened. Eventually, the developer gave up and sold the land to a conservation trust that turned it into protected wilderness. I visited the site once, about 2 years after the fire. Standing on that bluff overlooking the Atlantic, I could sense echoes of what happened, screams and terror, imprinted on the landscape like a psychic recording that would probably persist for decades. I performed a blessing and cleansing of the land itself, but some places carry scars too deep to fully heal. Now you might wonder why I'm sharing this story, why I'm speaking about things most people aren't ready to hear. The answer is simple. People need to understand the occult is not a game, that grimoires and spell books are not harmless curiosities, that there are real consequences to opening doors without knowing what's on the other side. Sarah was an innocent child with a sensitive soul who was given a weapon she couldn't understand by an adult who should have known better, Mrs. Carmichael died of a heart attack less than a year after giving Sarah that book, and I sometimes wonder if she realized in those final moments what she'd done, what chain of events she'd set in motion. Or maybe she knew exactly what she was doing. Maybe she'd been influenced by the same entities that later worked through Sarah. The entities that worked through that grimoire are still out there, still looking for new vessels, still patient and calculating, and utterly without mercy. They've been doing this for thousands of years, but we serve a God more powerful than any demon, any entity, any force of darkness. That's not a platitude. It's objective truth I've witnessed, demonstrated repeatedly. Evil is real, but it's not ultimate. Darkness is powerful, but light is stronger. I'll close with one final detail. About 7 years after the fire, I was contacted by the conservation trust that owns the land where Robert Wilson's beach house once stood. They'd been doing ecological surveys and discovered something unusual. In the exact spot where the house had been, where 15 people died in flames, wildflowers were growing in abundance. Not scattered blooms, but a carpet of flowers appearing every spring in defiant profusion, a riot of color and life emerging from a place of death. The conservationists said they'd never seen anything like it, that soil quality didn't explain the growth. But there they were, wave after wave of wildflowers, blooming and dying and blooming again, as if the earth itself was determined to transform tragedy into beauty, death into life, darkness into light. I'd like to think that's what happened to Sarah's soul, too, that after being freed from the entities that used her, she was allowed to bloom into whatever beautiful form awaits the innocent in the next life. I choose to believe in redemption and resurrection, not just as abstract theological concepts, but as concrete realities applying even to the worst situations. Because if I didn't believe that, I couldn't continue this work. I've seen too much horror, too much senseless suffering, too many innocents destroyed. The only thing that keeps me going is faith that every battle matters, that every person we save counts, that light always returns no matter how long darkness persists. So I continue the work. I continue fighting battles, performing exorcisms, cleansing spaces where darkness has taken hold, teaching people to protect themselves from spiritual attack. It's not glamorous. It's often terrifying, frequently exhausting, and sometimes seems utterly futile facing evil that's been perfecting its craft for millennia. But it matters. Every case matters, every person helped matters, every grimoire removed before it finds another Sarah matters. If this story has affected you, if you recognize elements in your own life or someone you love, don't ignore it. Don't rationalize it away. And please, don't try to handle it alone. Reach out for help, whether to me or another trained priest, whether to a spiritual director or pastor who takes these matters seriously. The earlier you intervene, the more likely you prevent tragedy. Sarah's family waited too long, dismissed too many warning signs, and paid a terrible price. And for those simply curious about these matters, who watch videos like this for entertainment or because you're interested in the paranormal, who think that learning about occult practices is just harmless research or intellectual curiosity, I want to emphasize as strongly as I possibly can, this is not a game. This is not entertainment. This is not a hobby you can pick up and put down at will. The occult is not a subject for casual exploration by people who lack proper training and protection. Grimoires are not collectibles to be displayed on shelves like paperbacks or comic books. Ouija boards are not toys despite being sold in the toy section of department stores. Tarot cards are not harmless fortune-telling devices. Rituals found on internet forums or in library books are not party tricks to perform for your friends. The forces you're playing with when you engage with these things are real. They're intelligent in ways that far exceed human intelligence. They're patient in ways that span lifetimes and generations, and they're far more dangerous than you understand or can understand until it's too late, and you're already caught in patterns you can't escape. They don't present themselves as evil. They don't show up with red skin and horns and pitchforks announcing their intention. to destroy your life. They come as curiosity, as intellectual interest, as the desire for knowledge or power or insight. They come as friends, as guides, as benevolent spirits who only want to help you achieve your potential. Every single person I've worked with over my 20 years as an exorcist, every single case of genuine spiritual attack or possession or oppression I've encountered, every single family destroyed by occult practices, they all started out thinking they were just exploring, just being open-minded, just having a bit of harmless fun. None of them intended to end up where they did. None of them thought that reading a book could open doorways in their mind that entities would pour through. None of them believed that speaking words in ancient languages could have actual power to summon things that would torment them. None of them imagined that their curiosity would lead to ruined lives, broken families, destroyed careers, mental illness, addiction, or in some cases death. But intentions don't matter much when you're dealing with entities that see your whole life as a game board, that perceive time differently than you do, that can see 100 moves ahead while you're still trying to understand the rules of the game. These beings have been perfecting their craft for thousands of years, studying human psychology, learning exactly which buttons to push, which desires to exploit, which fears to amplify. They know how to make darkness look like light, how to make slavery feel like freedom, how to make destruction seem like enlightenment. And they're very, very good at it because they've had millennia of practice and millions of victims to learn from. So please, I'm begging you, be wise in how you approach these matters. Be cautious in what you invite into your life and into your home. Respect the boundaries that exist between our world and the realms beyond. Boundaries that were established for very good reasons. Boundaries that protect us from forces we were never meant to encounter directly. Don't assume that because you're smart or educated or rational, that you're immune to spiritual attack. Some of the most brilliant minds I've known have been destroyed by occult practices precisely because their intelligence made them overconfident, made them think they could control forces that can't be controlled, made them believe they could play with fire without getting burned. If you're a parent, I urge you with everything in me to protect your children from this darkness. Teach them these truths, not to frighten them, but to prepare them. Give them both awareness of spiritual realities and the armor of faith to defend themselves. Monitor what they're reading, what they're watching, what they're researching online. Don't assume that because something is popular or widely available that it's safe. Don't trust that the occult imagery saturating our entertainment and culture is harmless symbolism with no real power behind it. Don't let your children end up like Sarah, destroyed before their life really began, because someone gave them access to knowledge they couldn't safely handle, because they stumbled into darkness that adults should have protected them from. Watch for warning signs. If your child becomes obsessed with occult subjects, if they start having nightmares or seeing things that aren't there, if their personality changes dramatically, if they become withdrawn or secretive or start displaying knowledge they shouldn't have, take it seriously. Don't dismiss it as a phase or teenage rebellion or overactive imagination. Don't wait until the problem becomes so obvious that it can't be ignored anymore. Intervene early, intervene decisively, and don't try to handle it alone. Seek help from people who understand spiritual warfare, whether that's an exorcist like me, or a spiritual director at your church, or a pastor who takes these matters seriously and has experience dealing with them. The earlier you intervene in cases of spiritual attack, the more likely you are to prevent real tragedy, to catch the problem before it metastasizes into something that destroys lives and families. Sarah's family waited too long, dismissed too many warning signs, rationalized away too many red flags, and they paid a terrible price for their delay. 15 people died because adults didn't take a child's spiritual crisis seriously enough, because they couldn't see past their own assumptions and biases to recognize genuine danger, because they thought modern rationalism had made such concerns obsolete and superstitious. This has been Father Peter, and I've just shared with you the story of Sarah Wilson and the grimoire that destroyed her, a story that cost 15 lives and scarred countless others, a story that continues to unfold even now in ways I'm still discovering. I've told you the truth as I know it, as I witnessed it firsthand, as I fought against it with every tool and weapon the Church has given me for spiritual warfare. I've shared details that make me uncomfortable to speak about, events that still give me nightmares years later, manifestations that challenged everything I thought I understood about the nature of reality and the limits of evil's power in our world. What you do with this information is ultimately up to you. I can't force you to believe me, can't make you take these warnings seriously, can't prevent you from making the same mistakes that Sarah and her family made. All I can do is bear witness to what I've seen, share what I've learned through 2 decades of fighting battles most people don't believe exist, and hope that somewhere someone hears this message and makes different choices, better choices, choices that lead toward light instead of darkness. But I pray with everything in me that you'll take this seriously, that you'll let it inform how you approach the spiritual realm, how you think about occult practices, how you protect yourself and your loved ones from forces that want nothing more than to destroy you. I pray that you'll remember Sarah, remember what happened to her, remember the price she paid for innocence corrupted, for gifts twisted into curses, for doors opened that should have stayed sealed. I pray that you'll never forget that every choice matters in ways we often don't see until it's too late, that every door you open leads somewhere, and sometimes the price of curiosity is far, far higher than anyone should ever have to pay. May God protect you from the darkness that surrounds us all, the darkness that presses against the boundaries of our world every moment of every day, seeking entry points, looking for vulnerable souls, waiting with patience that spans generations for opportunities to corrupt and destroy. May He grant you the wisdom to see threats before they fully manifest in your life, the courage to confront them when that recognition finally comes, and most importantly, the faith strong enough to sustain you through whatever spiritual battles may lie ahead on your path. And may you never ever have to learn these hard lessons the way Sarah and her family learned them, through suffering and loss and tragedy that echoes through the years, through deaths that could have been prevented if only someone had understood the true nature of the danger, if only someone had been willing to acknowledge that evil is not metaphor but terrible reality. The battle between light and darkness continues every single day, in places seen and unseen, in moments both dramatic and mundane, wherever human souls encounter forces beyond their comprehension. And those of us who've been called to stand in the gap between worlds, to serve as warriors and protectors in this ancient conflict, we will keep fighting with every breath in our bodies until our very last moment on this earth. Thank you for listening to Sarah's story, for bearing witness to her tragedy, and may peace be with you always in this life and whatever comes after.